But nevertheless, we have to some extent liberated ourselves from the kind of colonial shackles that we were chained by in the past. Yet we live in a context where colonization, even in its raw form, as we would have spoken about in the mid-20th century, still exists. And certainly the issue that we want to talk about, solidarity with the Palestinian people, is one where colonization not only exists, but is stuck, as well as one where colonization is part of, or one might say, some might say, the main factor within a combination of crimes and sins. Palestinians live under occupation, Palestinians live under apartheid, Palestinians live under colonization, all at the same time. And the effects of that are on Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory, whether Gaza and the West Bank, including Jerusalem, of course, or in the 48 areas within what is called Israel, or Palestinian refugees in the neighboring countries and in the diaspora. All Palestinians live under the yoke of apartheid, occupation, and colonization in some form or the other. And so I'm very glad that the first webinar that was organized since our meeting in Dakar a few months ago, where the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network had its kind of in-person launch and first in-person meeting and conference, strategy meeting and conference, that the first major webinar since then, and certainly the first webinar organized by the Youth Task Team, focuses particularly on this issue of decolonization, but not just decolonization, decolonization and how to build global solidarity against it. So we have with us a few speakers that are very able to deal with this topic, and I'm going to move over to allow them to do so now, so that you can stop being forced to listen to me, who you didn't really expect to have to listen to. But I was told by the youth group that I had to pay for my supper, so I had to give some kind of a speech. We have 5 speakers on our schedule. Each of them will speak for about 15 minutes, and after that we'll open it up for discussion. We have a speaker from Palestine, Tunisia, Namibia, Ghana, and Kenya. As I said earlier on, for those who might just have joined us, unfortunately, all our speakers will be speaking in English. And unfortunately, we don't have a translation. But our first speaker, appropriately, of course, is our Palestinian speaker. Layth Hanbali is a freelance researcher in Palestine, living in Palestine. He focuses on community health and global health. He's also a member of Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and he has been a public health practitioner, doctor, and organizer. So let me pass on immediately to Layth. Layth, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Naeem. Thank you so much to the African Palestine Solidarity Network for hosting this event, for inviting me. I'm very, very honored to be amongst such incredible, inspiring comrades. So yeah, thank you for having me. Now, the first thing I'd like to do, if you'd let me, is just give a shout out to some Palestinian activists in the Palestinian youth movement who are currently undertaking or planning for a Twitter storm taking place right now. And it is basically to raise the voices and raise the struggle of people in Masafer Yatta to the world. Masafer Yatta is an area near Hebron where whose residents are being forced out of their ancestral homes of several generations. There are people living there who have existed there on that land for longer than the state of Israel, and Israel is forcing them off their land to essentially make way for a firing zone. That is the excuse that it's a military zone, even though it is the continuation of colonial practices and policies practiced by the Zionists in Palestine. So if anyone uses Twitter, I'd just encourage you to go and participate in the storm taking place right now. And I have just put the hashtag in the chat, and please do tweet that out to your followers. Now, what I'm going to talk about in 15 minutes is nowhere near enough. I think a lifetime is nowhere near enough to to address these topics. Sorry, I'm just going to ask if anyone is able to unmute them, mute themselves if they're unmuted. That'd be great, just to make sure everyone can hear clearly. But I'm going to cover a bit of just a really brief touch on the history of British and Zionist colonization in Palestine. I can't do that justice in the few minutes that I'm going to dedicate to it, but I'm just going to offer a few highlights and move on to talk about the links between the colonization of Palestine and the colonization of Africa, and these kind of shared systems of oppression that have been imposed on us by the global north and by imperialist and colonial interests. I'm going to do a little bit of a kind of deep dive into coloniality and where that fits into the equation and how that manifests today and how it fits into the equation, and then end by introducing kind of a few ideas about how, well, first of all, why our struggles are not as connected as they used to be, and then offer a bit of a perspective on how I think they could be connected going forward, as Naeem illustrated kind of the importance of that. So again, just a few highlights. This is not going to be a history lesson, but just a few highlights on the history here. So the first thing to note is the really strong, important role that the British played in the colonization of Palestine. And this, like the British interests everywhere, I think we've got people from all over the African continent here. I think a lot of comrades here will be living under the consequences of British imperialism. We know that the British and their actions in our countries, on our lands, towards our people, have consistently been driven by their imperialist interests first and foremost. So, that led them to, in Palestine, back first a continuation of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 20th century. Beginning of the 20th century. And then they moved on to backing Arab independence, because they basically said, if the Arabs revolt against the Ottomans, then we'll give them independence. At the same time, they were cooking up deals with the French to create basically a set of client states in the Eastern Mediterranean after they take them over at the end of the First World War. And then finally, they decided to establish a Zionist state in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration, announcing in 1917 that the British government supports, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, end quote. Now, you might think the British aren't very decisive. That's why they keep changing their minds about who they're going to back in the area. But actually, it was all very calculated. And each step of the way, what they wanted to do was maintain their imperial interests. One of the key things, for example, was controlling the Suez Canal. One of the other things that they wanted was maintain a land bridge with India for their trade. That was always the goal. And they kept changing what they wanted in the area, depending on what was going to offer them that. Until today, Israel offers them a continuation, an extension of their imperialist interests in the region, and so they keep backing it. And to read a bit more about that, kind of more in the present day, I'd encourage you to go to an article that my colleague Layth Hanbali wrote, and I'll link that in the chat as well, if you want to read about the current state of British complicity in the oppression of Palestinians. Now, the Zionist movement, again, I could go on about this for hours and weeks and months, but I'm just going to highlight a few things again, and not the whole story. But essentially, the basis of the state of Israel is violence. It was birthed through violence being committed towards Palestinian people, and there is no path to the state of Israel that doesn't involve the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So in the Nakba, Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic. That's what we call what happened in 1948, when 800,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from Palestine by Zionist militias, inflicting various forms of violence, killing, maiming, injuring, rape, intimidation, suppression, expulsion, siege of towns and villages, leading to the complete obliteration of hundreds of villages that today just don't even exist on a map. The creation of a refugee population that today numbers one of the biggest refugee populations in the world. The vast majority of Palestinian people are refugees today. So that is how Israel was created. It continued that policy of violence through the years. So in 1967, inflicting more violence to occupy what remained of Palestine. So they occupied 78% of Palestine in 1948. The rest of it in 1967, and continues to occupy all of it. Scholastica, could I just ask you to mute yourself, please, just so everyone else can hear? Thanks. Thank you. One of the other things to highlight as well that is a recent modern trend in the Zionist movement is this kind of new fashion statement that Zionists do by claiming that they are indigenous to Palestine. But the thing to highlight here is that even their own history completely decimates those claims that they could even believe this, because what the founders of political Zionism were essentially discussing in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, this movement that grew in Europe, they were considering many other places to colonize before they decided that they were going to colonize Palestine. So they thought about colonizing Madagascar, Uganda, Cyprus, the Sinai, lots of other places. But this is just like gives you a flavor of the fact that the colonization of Palestine, just like the colonization of everywhere else, is a political movement. It's not about settlers being indigenous to that land. It's just about exploitation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. The other thing to mention about this whole indigenous claim is that the Zionist organization, when in Europe it was setting up the governance tools to enable the colonization of Palestine, named the organizations that they founded things like the Jewish Colonial Trust, the Colonization Committee, and the Palestine Land Development Committee. Now, they were very explicit about the fact that they wanted to colonize Palestine. You don't colonize somewhere if you're indigenous to it. So just wanted to kind of highlight that little gem that Zionists are recently trying to claim. And that actually, is something that was repeated in lots of other settler colonial movements, including in Africa. And that's kind of why I wanted to highlight it, is colonizers claiming indigeneity, which is completely ridiculous. But something to be aware of. Now, just to cover what the Palestinian population was doing as this colonization was taking place, before talking about how this links to colonization in general, and the Palestinian population, resisted the colonization, quite hard. So there were protests, civil disobedience, armed resistance, and general strikes, and lots of other methods that Palestinians tried to resist colonization through, and there were kind of significant uprisings that are documented, as well as continuous resistance throughout the period of British and Zionist colonization. But the famous revolts were in 1921, 1929, 1933, 1936, and the biggest one in 1939. So you're talking about literally like every few years, every like 2 or 3 years, you've got like a rebellion going on. So Palestinians tried really hard, as people under colonization do, to resist this. And that's something that colonizers often try to erase, is that the people who are colonized do not want that colonization, but it's something that colonizers convince themselves sometimes, or try to convince us, isn't true. And the British obviously suppressed those uprisings, and then Israel did the same. And actually, a lot of the tactics that Israel uses today were ones that the British started, such as house demolitions, deportations, administrative detention, in which Palestinians are detained without trial or charge. These were all kind of British tactics. I'm just going to ask anyone who is unmuted to mute themselves, if that's possible, please. Thank you. Okay. And so,
I'm not.
Sorry.
Riyadh, can you please mute yourself? It's really disruptive for the speakers when people are unmuted and we hear background noise.
Thank you. Thanks. Now, to talk about the link now between kind of the colonization of Palestine, decolonization of Palestine, and Africa and the rest of the world. The thing to highlight here is that, as Naeem said, there was actually a lot of cross solidarity between liberation movements all over the world, and this dwindled essentially with the rise of neoliberalism at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. But there were a lot of kind of shared struggles that were being fought, and training, sharing of resources, sharing of expertise, sharing of understanding, of intellectual exercises, etc. And the reason for this is that it's often the same context that drives colonization all over the world, but it just manifests differently. And I think, as this is predominantly an African audience, I think this if you take a Pan-African perspective, that there were different forms of colonialism that were imposed in different parts of Africa, but it was all essentially violent. It was all exploitative, and it essentially tried to exploit people for their labor, exploit land for its resources. It tried to subjugate people, to other them, to dismantle communities, and to impose certain values. And all of that was done with the intention of benefiting capitalist interests of the colonizers. So that's, it's the same structure that props up and promotes colonization all over the world, wherever it's practiced. So that for that reason, you've got the kind of the idea of shared struggle. And we see this kind of maybe manifesting today in this kind of discourse around coloniality. Coloniality is just another pillar of colonialism, and it's just this production of knowledge that imposes certain values, certain knowledge, and it's essentially Western knowledge, Western values on the rest of the world. You see that kind of, my interests is particularly in healthcare, so that's kind of where I see this. And you see it, for example, in the global health organizations mirror the same power dynamics of the colonized versus the colonizers. It's that same power dynamic in those institutions, for example. You see that in, for example, not being able to articulate what our conceptualizations of healthcare are. We have these very individualized biomedical forms of healthcare being imposed on us, for example, where the relationship is just between a doctor and a patient in a room, and there is no consideration made for the effects of community and social and political effects on people's health, which is a lot more aligned with how we see healthcare as Indigenous people. There's also the kind of more material impact of the relationship between Israel and a lot of other colonizers. And Israel, for example, continued supplying apartheid South Africa with weapons long after everyone else stopped, including supporting its nuclear program. And other imperialist forces, such as the US and the UK, supported South Africa and tried to shield it from sanctions, long after the rest of the world had kind of got to that point. We see the same situation here today, where lots of solidarity is being expressed by people who don't wield that much power, but the imperialists, the colonizers, continue to prop up Israel. Israel is also currently, not talking about anything historical, it's currently the 6th largest exporter of weapons in the world. And it's also it stands behind a lot of extractive industries in Africa, for example, in the Congo, and provides a lot of the kind of security for those. So it's directly complicit in the exploitation of land and people in Africa today. But just to finish off, we seem to be in different places today compared to where we were a few decades ago, as Naeem said, where we don't share the struggle against colonialism and coloniality. Now, the reason I kind of highlighted both is that I think both exist, but they just, it's just that colonialism often just manifests in different ways. Colonialism still exists in some places, it doesn't in others. Neo-colonialism certainly exists in a lot of the world, and it dictates relationships between states, between people. And coloniality is a way to try to kind of disrupt knowledge formation and a lot of the relationships that we might have with each other, because it imposes these solutions from the outside on us. And there's just one thing I want to highlight here is that we often now talk about solidarity and we don't talk about joint struggle. And this is, I think, symptomatic of the fact that we're very fragmented. And the reason I think we're fragmented is that we have been moved away from identifying the root cause of the problem, which is imperialism and colonialism. So how do we go back to joint struggle? How do we see, I would like people to see Palestinian solidarity as a cause that affects them if they are under the grip of imperialism or colonialism, because we're essentially fighting the same fight. I would like not just to be in solidarity with someone else who's under colonialism. I would like to be in joint struggle with them. So how do we joint struggle? I think a few things that we can think about, and this is a perfect place to start this forum here, is we can identify and exchange our understanding and knowledge about systems of oppression and see, where they are the same or where they may share some features to improve our knowledge. And we can build understanding of strategies of anti-colonial work that we are undertaking in our localities, and then see how we can translate that across the world in order to reclaim power and in order to start lifting each other up through these kind of south-south bridges, through these kind of bridges between colonized, oppressed people all over the world. So with that, I'll end. Sorry for taking longer than I was given. But yeah, thank you so much for inviting me here, and I look forward to discussing this further with the panel.
Thank you, Layth, and I think you went just a minute over, so we'll forgive you. I think we owe Palestinians more than 1 minute, so yeah. But your last point...
I'm going to use that. If I ever run again, I'm going to use that. You owe me more than a minute.
Your last point about solidarity and joint struggle, I think is a very crucial one, particularly for those of us in the global South. I think that the way that we understand solidarity is very much as joint struggle, not as doing things for other people. And so this reminds me, Layth, of a quote from Comrade Samora Machel, the late president of Mozambique and leader of Frelimo, who said that international solidarity is not an act of charity. It is an act of unity between allies fighting on different terrains towards the same objectives. Solidarity, he said, is an assertion that no people is alone, no people is isolated in the struggle for progress. It is the conscious alliance of the progressive and peace-loving revolutionary forces in the common struggle against colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. In short, against exploitation of human by human. Solidarity has no race and no color, and its country has no frontiers. There is no solidarity just among Africans, no exclusively Asian solidarity, since the enemy of the people also has no country and no race. And so clearly exactly what you're talking about, Layth, joint struggle. Our second speaker was to be Samar Tlili from Tunisia. Unfortunately, Samar is unable to be here. Her father has taken ill and she's right now at the hospital with him. So our prayers and thoughts go out to Samar and her family at this somewhat difficult time. She did say to us that she has prepared a paper. She will send us the paper. And so if we have everyone's email address, we can send them a copy of that. So someone's not listening, but we'll pass the message on to her that we are all thinking about her and her family at this time. We'll move on to the third speaker then. And our third speaker is my neighbor, Ester Shitana. Ester is a lawyer. She is also a former Deputy Secretary General of the Namibia National Students Organization, member of the National Advisory Council of Basic Education in Namibia, and a whole list of other positions that she holds, which I'm not going to mention. But those of you who were at our conference in Dakar in March will know that the one thing that Ester has not put on her CV is that she's a really good dancer and she can teach us all how to toi-toi. Ester. You are muted, so we can't hear your protestations.
Oh, sorry. I was saying, what an introduction. You just gave me away. Now, if I show some people my dance move and they're not satisfied, I'll be in big trouble. But yes, it may. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And before I start or proceed, allow me to really just extend my sincere gratitude for the invitation to participate in this discussion. But I'm really, really happy to be here, but most importantly, also to be a part of the PAPSN family. As introduced, my name is Ester Shitana, and I'm from Namibia. I've been really tasked to give a speech based on 3 thematic areas. That is one, to give a brief overview of the history of Namibia. Number 2, to then provide you guys with insight as to whether or not the footprints of colonialism are still seen in, even after 32 years of independence as a country. And thirdly, to look into why is it so important that as the Global South, we are united towards fighting for a common good. So Namibia gained its independence on the 21st of March, 1990, after a long and brutal fight. Faced with the brutality of the occupying powers, your liberation movements with the likes of SWAPO came up with appropriate and a plethora of strategies on how to best fight apartheid South Africa. In the case of Namibia, SWAPO pursued 3 strategies, namely that is political mass mobilization of the Namibian people. Number 2, the intensification of the international campaign to mobilize an international opinion to the just cause of the Namibian people. And then number 3, and of course, as a last resort, that is of course to then waging of the armed liberation struggle. So obviously, for those that have studied the history of South Africa and Namibia, you would realize that one of the game changers that eventually led to the independence of Namibia would be the Battle of Vale, where the Cuban internationalists, together with the Angolan forces, as well as the as well as the SWAPO plan fighters, defeated apartheid South Africa. Obviously, whilst we recognize that game changer and that event that took place, we equally also recognize that it was as a result of the execution of other strategies as well that eventually, obviously, the independence of Namibia. And indeed, if you read the history of Namibia, you would see that there's so many obstacles that were thrown in the way in a bid to delay our journey to independence. But due to the unwavering support of the international community, that is particularly fellow Africans, Latin America and Caribbeans, Asia and Pacific, Namibia was able to endure the different types of maneuvers and eventually gain independence. I think the previous speaker and even the chair spoke about the importance of international solidarity and international solidarity and how holding hands as people can eventually lead to such great results. And I think when you look at the history and the story of Namibia and its journey to independence, you'll be able to see that truly international solidarity and standing together towards the common goal does eventually lead to the attainment of whatever goal or objective that is the collective we're striving to achieve. as to address the question of then, are there still footprints of colonialism even in an independent Namibia? The answer to that is yes. I think even in an independent Namibia, we are still able to see the gruesome footprints and the ripple effects of colonialism. I think like with any brutal oppression of people and so forth. And even when you look at, I think when you read the books of the likes of Yongugu wa Thigongo, like Matingara, he beautifully lays down and tells the story of how as Africa we have been colonized. And, you know, I think he highlights something very important, how deeply our colonizers have entrenched their values and their system and the way they work into us, so much so that at times we also become the oppressor of other people and so forth. So really, when you talk about whether or not the footprints of colonialism can still be seen in Namibia, my answer to that is yes. Again, you would see that for Namibia, colonialism was really deeply tainted with the dispossession of people, specifically even with land, where people were removed from their homes and placed elsewhere. And even when you look in, when you read the news or what's happening in Namibia, you would see that, for example, the issue of land, the land question, is still a major debate in Namibia. I mean, you would see that white people still basically own most of the commercial land and so forth. So I think that in itself is a testament and proof of the fact that colonialism still sort of has its footprints in an independent Namibia. But even when you look at the likes of, you know, your unemployment rate in Namibia is still high and so forth, because of either the gap in terms of skills and also an education system that might not, or that is not reviewed to such an extent that it's befitting of the circumstances or the Namibian people even after that. So truly, yes, I would answer yes to that particular question insofar as colonialism it is concerned. In respect of the last thematic area, right, where you asked then, what is then the importance of the global South sort of uniting and so forth? You know, each time I hear the word unity or unified, I'm always taken back and reminded of the notable words of our founding president, the founding president of the Republic of Namibia, Dr. Sam Shafishuna Nujoma. And he likes to say, and I quote, "A people united and striving to achieve a common good for all members of society will always emerge victorious." So I think when I hear that, I'm reminded that of how at the end of the day, if we are all striving towards one common good, we are always going to emerge victorious. Either way. I mean, when you look at the global South, we are not only connected by virtue of sharing similar problems, but also history in of itself. And I think there's been a lot of talk about history and so forth. So we are connected in terms of that. So the idea that when countries are unified, change is brought forth is not just an idea, but it's something that is very pragmatic, and you see forth results, like in case in point Namibia and so forth. So I think even in this particular discussion, for me, when you look at, for example, issues of the Agenda 2030, right? They have a preamble that they make reference to. They always say there can be no sustainable development without peace and no peace without sustainable development. And you see that member states have paid increased attention, you know, to the interlinkage between peace and security and as well as development. So at the end of the day, we realize that it is essential to multiply and diversify the efforts to enhance inclusive peace and as well as development, so that you are moving away from just mere statements and slogans, and you're moving more into action and seeing forth results and so forth. So I think for me, really a unified global South is an additional and complementary path to really renew, revitalize, and multiply the alternatives to sustain inclusive development and peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Esther, for that, and from a Namibian perspective. We'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is going to be Hassana Adongo Ibrahim, And as a good socialist, she gave me a one-line bio and refused to allow me to introduce her any more than one line, which is to say that she is a member of the socialist movement of Ghana. Hassana.
Good evening to everyone. Hello, can you hear me?
Hear you, go for it.
Okay, yeah, good evening to everyone. And I must say, I'm very grateful to be here today for this session. I must say I've been thinking through a lot, and I've gained a lot of insights from my two other comrades who have spoken. And like the question was, the road to independence by Ghana wasn't an easy thing. And I would say a lot of Europeans entered into the country, and it was first started by the Portuguese in 1471, and then later by the Swedish, the Danes, and then others. And the last to settle actually was the British, which I know we all can attest to, because most of us were colonized by the British. So the last people to enter into Ghana, the Gold Coast, that was the then Gold Coast, which is Ghana now, was somewhere in the 1880s. And all of them were all about exploitation of our natural resources. And then later plunged into the exploitation of human resources. That's not only taking our natural resources by also engaging in slavery, and then taking our human resources to foster the industrialization growth they needed in the country. Fast forward, we can't talk about independence and decolonization without mentioning Kwame Nkrumah, a young guy who from a small town, who had gone to the European countries, first in the US and then later to the United Kingdom to study, and then with other comrades decided to set up the Pan-African Conference, which was in 1945 in Manchester. And then saw the need for Ghana and other African countries to gain independence, to be able to be the conference major on the certain resolutions, the organization, and socialism and independence. Kwame Nkrumah came into Ghana first as a general secretary upon invitation by the United Gold Coast Convention to be a secretary for the organization. But the ideology of that party was not tallying the ideology he had. The United Gold Coast Convention wanted to attain independence in a short as Kwame Nkrumah wanted. Kwame Nkrumah, we gained independence and then helped other African countries gain independence, and then unite. It was going to help with the liberation of not just Ghana, but other African countries. So there was a lot that happened. Prevalence of it was the 28th February crossroads that led to the death of 3 ex-servicemen and led to the arrest of Kwame Nkrumah and Samuel there was an election that was held, and Kwame Nkrumah, even in prison, and I would say
sorry, Hassana, can you hold on a minute, please? Mariam and Samuel Jonas, can you mute yourselves, please? Okay, continue, please. Sorry about that, Hassana.
It's fine. So, like I said, towards the road of independence, there was a lot of violence, brutality, mass protests all over. And one prevalent of them was the 28th February unrest that led to the death of 3 ex-servicemen. And that led to the arrest of Kwame Nkrumah and some leaders. During that time, there was an election, and even in detention, he won as a prime minister. And then the support base at that time, the struggle for independence has spread a lot, and he had gained the support of many working class, the market women, the fishermen, and all those people. So it was that tone that helped push the independence we needed as a country. And then, like I said, the split from the United Gold Coast Convention sets the pace for the setting up of the new party. What that was the Convention's People's Party that led to the election of Kwame Nkrumah as a president, and then further helping other African countries to gain independence, and then further, I would say. So political independence was, as Kwame Nkrumah said, was not going to be the end, as because we're going to get independence and all that, but he believed that there was going to set a tone for a different form of colonization. And that's what we see now, that the neo-colonization we see now. He had a mentality of ensuring that, how do I put it, becoming a president, he would transform the social agenda that would run through the health, education, industrialization, and everything. So he set up a lot of institutions, factories that was aimed at helping the working class to gain something, because he believed the resources was not meant to be for just a few, but for the whole of the pace, and then set us catalyst for Africans to also, other Africans would be able to manage country, but the African continent. So the second question, I would say a legacy, but footprints of neo-colonization, because they set a certain foundation for the country, that's instead of the independence bringing us opportunities, it has rather, well, I would say, I didn't mention the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, which is very important. And at the time of his overthrow, a lot of people didn't understand the ideology on which he started I would say a lot of people didn't understand his ideology of socialist transformation. So with the help of the United States and the CIA, whilst he was away in Hanoi for a peace treaty, he was overthrown shamefully, and it's observed in my organization as the Day of Shame, where we bring people together to talk about how the situation has plunged us in the kind of the situation we are facing in Ghana right now. So I would say neo-colonization has left a footprint that continues to push the Western world, because it's a system of exploitation and sets values that pushes their markets, because it's set up as a system of subsistence farming, where we produce our own local economy just to feed ourselves, and then the most important resources are channeled into their industries, and it's brought back to us because of the set values they've set for us here. So it's brought back to us for us to purchase them by the bourgeoisie. So the system which they set for us continues to reign, a capitalist system where it's just profits motive, doesn't have any sort of feeling for the working class or the poor. And lastly, the question about how the global South people can be united to work towards the struggles we are all facing. Most of the countries in the global South were colonized by British, yeah, and Nkrumah believed that the independence of Ghana was going to be meaningless unless it's linked with the total liberation of African continent and the other global South countries. Because right now, as we speak, capitalists still plunder in our global, especially with specific focus on the global South. All countries within this region are fighting at different fronts. The global South needs to understand that we all need to play our role to ensure that we attain the goal we have set forth. Countries must actually pay attention to building movements, not just how would I put? It must build united platforms so that we can. It's like we are all fighting at different fronts. We need to set a pace where we can all fight in a united front so that the shackles of colonization can be brought down. Yeah, so like I said, the chains of foreign control needs to be taken down, and without unity, it's going to be just a meaningless fight. So I think I would end here and then let our other speakers continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hassana, from the socialist movement of Ghana. Our next speaker is from the other side of the continent, from west to east. We are talking now, or we're going to listen rather, to Suhayl Omar. Suhayl is from Kenya, and Suhayl is a researcher based at a university in Kenya. His research interests lie in theorizing policing, surveillance, militarism, and public health precarity in Africa and the rest of the world. Suhayl.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all the speakers who've spoken before me, and for this virtual gathering. To the organizers, thank you so much for putting in the labor to bring us all together and just exchange knowledge. To begin with, I would first like to be in solidarity with everyone resisting empire, colonialism, and Israeli fascism all across the world. As we know, as we are living, we do know the lengths at which Israeli fascism is manifesting in all aspects, from public health to the arts. And just recently, we saw how Germany, as a state and as a colonial collaborator of not just German fascism, but also Israelis complicity in the genocide of Palestinians, is being executed and manifesting through the arts and cultural spaces. So I would like to, first of all, publicly declare my ardent support and solidarity to the people of Palestine and everyone who's pro-Palestinian in thought, in hurt, and in struggle. We're all in this together. And as we continue, I think one of the key solutions we need to understand has been beautifully put, and I'll just read it from a paper by Comrade Aya, where she speaks about public health. But I will set the paper, but I just want to begin by reading the first paragraph, which she mentions, which can also be a solution as we go on, but something to think about in not just global solidarity with Palestine, but also our global path in resisting coloniality, where she mentions on May 18th, where they penned the manifesto of
sorry, Suhayl. It seems when you turn away from the computer, we can't hear you.
Oh, oops, sorry. So I'll just read from the other article, which I will send in the comment chat, where the Palestinians called for a general strike on May 18th amid what they described as a united intifada, where they penned the manifesto of hope and to articulate the significance of Palestinians, transforming the condition of the Shitat, which is diaspora or the dispersal into the global world, into a synchronous multi-sided resistance. And the manifesto mentions this particular line, which gives us and makes us understand that hope in itself is a discipline, and there's no resistance without hope and dignity. Where it mentions, "It is now time for this tragedy to end. Long live a united Palestine, long live the Intifada of unity." And the issue, the reason I feel and insist on reading this part is because as colonized people, we need to understand that coloniality doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's built over time, and it also happens by participants, by actors who come together. So how do we decolonize a militarized world, and how do we decolonize a world that's actively engaging with militarism to entrench the coloniality that we're seeing? And using Israel as an example, and using the theory of the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery, we are seeing that colonialism is not just a structure, it's a superstructure that affects the globe at large. But the key thing is we need to understand who is in the core, who is in the semi-periphery, who's in the periphery, and who's at the underscores of receiving the crumbs. So particularly, one thing about Israel's, I will say, the global South is actively engaging and actively under subjugation, and that's the main goal of coloniality and colonialism. But we need to understand how this manifests in itself, and how has Africa, and the larger global South, for example, the continent, I will speak primarily on the continent and a few countries within Africa, particularly how has a pro-Palestinian bloc become so pacified to become complicit in Israel's continued genocide, and also the infiltration of Israel into our very state. So one of the key things we need to understand is the mechanism of militarism within our continent. And just recently, we saw how Israel has been fighting to be given a seat at the African Union. So I want to look at this from a capacity of, we have understood what arms diplomacy is, we know what humanitarian diplomacy is, but what we're not understanding, and Israel's strategy with Africa, because they know Africa has a huge vote within the United Nations General Assembly, they are targeting individual actors so that they can spread misinformation and Israeli propaganda to form pseudo-allies within the continent, and also break this strong vote, with this strong pro-Palestinian vote within the United Nations General Assembly. And one of the things that I've theorized in helping me myself understand was using the term collateral diplomacy, where I used it to understand the mechanism of where refugees are being taken in exchange of weapons or in exchange of funding. For example, using the example of the continuous threats to close the Dadaab and Kakuma camps in Kenya, where the Kenya government threatened to close, and once they're given the billions by US aid and different cultural embassies in Kenya and the peripheries of imperial funding, once they get that funding, the camps remain open. So just briefly, I will go through some of these mechanisms of collateral diplomacy, where we see that Israel is actively building a wall and is trying to alienate and emancipate Africa, alienate and structurally exclude Africans from having a voice, where that if you are pro-Palestinian, for example, you see him as an iconoclast. Any pro-Palestinian rhetoric, you see him as someone who's supporter of violence. And this is where we're seeing the continued weaponization of terrorism comes, the continued weaponization of anti-terrorism comes in, where that you can't be pro-peace and support Palestine. It means it means there's a fallacy in between, which in itself is false, but this shows the manufactured propaganda and the very strong propaganda machine of Israel. So primarily, if we do look at the funding and security exports from Israel, we are seeing an increased, where Africa is an increased receiver of military arms, which are being termed as security exports to Africa, which totaled to about $71 million in 2009. And by 2019, before the pandemic, we had reached about $288 million, which is an increase of not just over 100%, it's actually an increase of 306% within that time. At the moment, we know COVID came, and COVID was a frontier for a new form of warfare, which was virtual warfare and surveillance warfare, that we will look at in depth in a bit. But primarily what we need to understand is, when we compare this general security exports, which have remained increasingly they have grown increasingly. We see back then, we knew Israel used to take this contracts and deals from a very clandestine mechanism, but now they are being more confident and actively engaging and telling us, sign this contract. We'll give you these arms, but in exchange you have to do this. And the problem with that is most of the voters within the African, most of the populations within the African countries and within the continent don't know what agreements are being signed between our states and Israel. And that's the biggest barrier. There's no active information of what is being signed by our leaders. So even the voting, even holding our own leaders to account becomes very difficult because we don't know what they've said. We don't know what they're saying in public, and we don't know what they're saying in private through this bilateral and multilateral deals, where we know the US, the UK are key third-party motivators for these deals to go through. So we need to understand, we're looking at this armed support. It's not that we're making this up or we're guessing this. It's from increased, what we're seeing now is, for example, in Uganda, the president and his son, the general, shared images of Special Forces Command soldiers carrying Israeli manufactured Galil Ace and Tava rifles and Uzi submachine guns. We need to ask ourselves, how are they actively using these mechanisms and this artillery so actively to cause chaos and conflict within other countries so they can come in and be seen as saviors and through peacekeeping missions. And for example, it just shows how we all understand through dialectical perspectives that when we speak about Israel and we speak about the US, these are nations, these are geographies of war making, so they have no conscience. But it's quite interesting because after 2019, the US, which provides Uganda with about 970 million annually, cut off all support to the Special Forces Command in 2019, citing human rights concerns, which is quite interesting and ironic because they are the ones who are funding violence against the Palestinian people. But it just shows that the Israeli state or the Israeli conscience to deal with human rights concerns, because even after the US cut the funding to the Special Forces Command, Israel continued funding them and continued creating a strong bond with President Museveni and the dictatorship in Uganda. And I think one of the key things that I came across and understood is that during the Israeli-Africa Security and Development Summit, Israeli arms exports spiked, and that was just another frontier for normalization within the continent. And now we do know with the African Union debacle that there is more interest by Africans to access these mechanisms of war from Israel because they do know that it's easier to access them if they do listen and act as lapdogs to expand colonialism within the continent. And just two other countries I would mention is Nigeria, where in 2017, a 13 million contract was signed for the supply of Aerostar UAVs and would be delivered within 18 months, which was delivered in 2019 because the contract was signed late 2017. And then in 2018, the then Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman visited Rwanda, Tanzania, and Zambia and forth and close of these deals himself particularly. So you do have to understand the presence and the importance of these deals if senior statesmen from Israel are coming within the continent to these territories to make sure these deals go through. And in Rwanda, we do know about the deal in exchange for receiving asylum seekers from being expelled from Israel, where in exchange we weren't sure what agreement was signed, but we know Rwanda is actively stooping very low towards the feet of the imperialists. We don't know the deal that came, the deal between Kagame and Priti Patel recently to receive deported refugees from the UK. And after this, this was, I think in 2020, after this deal was signed between Israel and Rwanda to access to receive and host the forcibly expelled asylum seekers, this was in 2015. In 2016, Rwanda received Atmos 2155 mm self-propelled Howitzer artillery from Israel. So we know that is an active reward for this mechanism. So in essence, just to practically close off the discussion on militarism and surveillance, COVID came and it was very difficult for these transportations, but geographies of war making must continue. This continued creations by the state to continue militarizing, to entrench subjugation and insist on power dynamics have to continue through geopolitics. We saw that during COVID, there was a lot of unearthing of new surveillance. So in as much as Israel is actively building walls, not just in Palestinian, occupied Palestinian territory, globally, it is trying to build walls of war. But in essence, we keep asking ourselves, what would a borderless world look like? And the solution to that, and the simple answer to that, has always been, it's the internet. We're all looking at it through the internet. As is now, we are in a borderless virtual gathering from different parts of the continent. But how do you explain coloniality in the spaces in virtual spaces? Because these aren't physical spaces. But we need to ask ourselves, when Israel is actively building walls physically, how are they ensuring that they build these walls virtually? So in early 2020, there was the early 2020, 2021, but I think it was at the height of COVID, there was the unearthing of the Israeli technology firm, the NSO Group, where the company's flagship product was Pegasus, which was a spyware that can stealthily enter a smartphone and gain access to everything on it, including its camera and its microphone. And Pegasus wasn't designed to just infiltrate any people's devices. It was used to particularly infiltrate the devices of pro-Palestinian activists, Palestinians living within the occupied territories, to map the travels and the routes. And also, it was actively being used on Android, BlackBerry, and iOS operating systems, with particular interest within iOS systems, which is the Apple iPhones, and then turn them into surveillance devices. So the company that says it sells Pegasus only to governments, but actively it was being used, and the justification was this is particular software that is being used to target criminals and terrorists. You can see the weaponization of preventing violent extremism and combating violent extremism, where at the moment it's being used to criminalize any form of dissent and criminalize any dissent against the growing fascist nation that is Israel. So we need to understand that, where did this come from? Pegasus in itself is a spyware developed by the Israeli cyber arms firms, the NSO Group, which is an Israeli firm that can be covertly installed on mobile phones, running mostly on iOS versions and also Android versions. So in the issue of building walls, we've reached a point where that even our virtual footprint is difficult to ascertain that we are engaging with our freedoms of expression and our freedoms of privacy within these spaces. But in essence, we're just actively colonial subjects that have been moved, and where at this time we are subjects of colonial violence physically. Within the virtual space, we are similar to dynamics of also colonial violence, because where my data is being used to spy on myself, it is also used to connect the dots and see how far this agitation, mobilization, and advocacy of the pro-Palestinian cause is reaching. And as I conclude, I just want to add on that it's very difficult to assert that we are in a dynamic or a stratosphere of that colonialism was back then. I think, and I believe, that colonialism is an ongoing mechanism, and we must combat it from the roots, because there's no way we can actively sit and say we are reforming colonialism. We can't reform colonialism. And I believe that many people here are from different backgrounds and actively engage with theory and different perspectives of theoretical thought and study. And in as much as knowledge is powerful, if we don't ensure that our pedagogy and what we learn, or the findings of this research that's being done, is being put into praxis, there's no use for us gathering this information. Because if we sit and discuss all these practicalities and then it ends after the discussion and everyone goes back to the normal forms of engagement, it becomes that it was time wasted. So there's issues of you're either pro-Palestinian or you are complicit. There's no you're an anti-colonialist, but you don't support that. And looking at the myriad of violence, the Palestinian cause encapsulates all forms of freedom seeking, all forms of liberation movements, all forms of social justice. Because if we look at the Palestinian cause, it is an indigenous community issue. It is a climate change issue because the Israeli occupational forces are actively using scorched earth policy mechanisms. It is a disability justice issue because the Israeli occupational forces are actively disabling and actively targeting the ability of the Palestinians within the occupied territories. It is a feminist issue. It is a queer issue. It is there's no global liberation without the liberation of Palestine. And as I close off, I just want to also mention that there's also a key thing as Africans we need to understand. It's either our nationalism is revolutionary nationalism, where we insist that our nationalism is in line with what we are being told, which rejects the specifics of any form of colonialism. And as mentioned by the speaker before me, Kwame Nkrumah is a perfect thought on this. But primarily we need to understand this reactionary nationalism where we sit and be like, our government is going to make decisions just for the Africans, must end at this. This is it should come to an end. It's either, if the Palestinians say the only solution is armed resistance, it has to be armed resistance. There's no double-sidism with the thought that, oh, we have to sit down, maybe a two-state solution. You aren't actively, if you're tired of engaging with Palestinian discourse, imagine how tired the Palestinians are for living under occupation for over 70 years. So with that, I am going to close off, but I will send some of the papers I had quoted in the comment box, and you can engage further. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suhayl. And thank you for bringing the issue home in a sense, particularly to talk about Israel's relationship with the African continent. So let me just make a point or two about that. Soon after PAPSN was formed last year, around March, I think it was, in June of last year, as many people might remember, the African Union Commission Chair, Musa Faki Mohammed, accredited Israel to the African Union. This, of course, set off a big campaign, both among states and civil society, against that accreditation. But that battle has not been won, and that battle continues, and that battle is one of the main issues on the agenda of the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network. So that issue of Israel's status in the African Union forms part of one of the focus areas of PAPSN, which is the African Union and anti-apartheid resolution at the UN, a broad kind of position of lobbying for PAPSN against Israel on the continent. There are 4 other focus areas that we identified at our meeting in Dakar earlier this year. One was what we called Christian Zionism, although that the group that deals with that later changed the name to talk about Christian support of Israel and Christian solidarity with the Palestinian people, because Christian support is more than just Christian Zionism. Then there's a group that deals, or focus that deals with agri-tech and the way in which Israel exploits that on the African continent. Then something that Suhayl pointed to, militarization, surveillance, hardware and software, etc., is another focus area. And then we have a focus area for youth, and the task team dealing with that put together this webinar, and for women. So these are the various focus areas that PAPSN has identified for our work moving forward. If you are in this webinar and interested in any particular one or more of those focus areas, please contact the people on the PAPSN steering committee. If you've missed people's details somehow, email info@papsn.net. Also send an email there so that you might receive Summer's paper, which she has prepared and unfortunately couldn't be here to present. So PAPSN has its agenda laid out for it, in a sense, for the next long while. And we want to mobilize across the continent in these various focus areas. At the meeting in Dakar in March, we had representatives of 23 different countries present, but that's still less than half of the number of countries on this continent. And so we certainly have a long way to go to grow and develop the organization, the network, and to strengthen its various campaigns. I want to open up the floor now for discussion, and particularly to hone in on the issue of solidarity, joint struggle, if you like, Layth, and how that might play out on the African continent in terms of the occupation, apartheid, and colonialism in the Palestinian context. A couple of people have already posted questions in the chat. I want to suggest that if you have a question, ask it yourself. If you don't want to and you post it there, I will ask it on your behalf. But I'd really prefer that people speak for themselves and ask the question. So if you do want to ask a question or make a comment, please put your hand up using the reaction button, and we will come to you. But before that, there was a request from that we ask one of the comrades from Morocco, who is part of the anti-normalization movement in Morocco, to speak to us for 2 minutes about what they do and about their activities in terms of the anti-normalization campaign. I think Morocco possibly has of all of the countries that have normalized relations with Israel over the past 2 years, Morocco has possibly the most active anti-normalization campaign. So I want to check who's here from Morocco. Sion, perhaps you could speak for 2 minutes on what you do, unless there's someone else from BDS Morocco or the anti-normalization campaign in Morocco that we want to speak. Sion, are you here? Will you speak? You can unmute yourself now. You can unmute yourself. Sion.
Okay, now I can. Hello, I am Sion from BDS Morocco, and BDS Morocco from years and years are working against normalization with other movements. But when it came to the official political normalization on the 10th of December 2020, it was created a special coalition named the Front to support Palestine and against normalization. For sure, during these 2 years, normalization with Israel by the official Morocco is very, very quick and important. We are calling it the tsunami of normalization, because every day is bringing something new. Last year, we have a military agreement, and for me and for us in general, we consider that it's the most important thing, because this new normalization is the core of it is military for us. But the normalization is very having for the officials in Morocco relationship with Israel began very early in 1961, when the Zionist organization with in the frame of an agreement with the official Morocco organized the immigration of the Jewish Moroccans, the Jewish Moroccan citizens then to Palestine to become instantly a colonizer of Palestine and participating in the army and using weapons against Palestinian people. That's a big first step of normalization for Morocco. And all along these years, there were new steps on all the levels, economic, navigation, and military, and political ties, and also at the level of intelligence. It is very known that Morocco is a big user of the software which is used to spy the phone, the iPhone, the mobile phones, and focusing on opponents, focusing on journalists who are working to denounce corruption and so on, and focusing also on the activists supporting Palestine. But what is very new, a part of this huge military step is the attempt to normalize the mind of people, because in Morocco, people in general, and it is very clear when you see people on the soccer, during the soccer matches, singing in solidarity with Palestine. Okay, I will not be much longer. What are the kind of things that we do in Morocco to oppose this? During this, from the beginning of our front, we organized days of solidarity. We are at the 6 days, and we are organizing sittings in many places in the country. In the same time, the same date and the same hour, people are going out in the street. It depended from in the 6 days, it was between 40 and 60 places, different places. Otherwise, we organize conferences. We organize conferences by internet, and we organize also protests by the way of communiques, and because there is a lot to denounce, because there is no agreement at the education level. There are agreements with universities, there are agreements in sport, there are a lot of agreements. It's very dangerous because it is an attempt to make in the mind of people that the relations with Israel are something normal and natural. And we are fighting this by these several ways. I hope I have answered to your question, Naim.
Thank you, Sion. The question was from Alma. I think she probably is happy with your response. I see a couple of questions coming in. Anat has a question. I'm not entirely sure, Anat, if you would like to ask it directly. Amal has another question as well. Anat, if you don't mind asking your question directly, so that we can get an appropriate speaker to respond.
Hello, everyone. I'm a PhD from Germany, and I'm working with South African universities in a collaboration to do with anti-colonial efforts. So because I'm a Jewish person and I support Palestine, and for me it is really interesting to know if the organizations that exist, which are anti-colonial in solidarity with Palestine, that are coming from a Jewish perspective, if those ties are important to you, the African context, if you just would like to know more, if there is some benefit to have also Jews within this kind of solidarity.
Thank
it's a
you,
question. It's a
Annette.
general question.
Yes, yes. Thank you for the question, Annette. Let me just respond very quickly to that. Instead of passing it on to the speakers, I'm wanting to respond because I'm South African, and perhaps on the continent, South Africa has the largest Jewish community these days. So in the South African context, for example, there are one or two Jewish initiatives that support the Palestinian struggle. Perhaps the most important being an organization called South African Jews for Free Palestine, which is also a member of the South African BDS Coalition. And the South African BDS Coalition is a member of PAPSN. The SAJFP, South African Jews for Free Palestine, is part of a number of global Jewish networks that support the Palestinian struggle, that are anti-Zionist, etc. So there are some of such initiatives. In Morocco, I know that within the anti-normalization movement, there are members who also are Jews. So yes, there are some such initiatives on the continent. I think that this is an angle that certainly needs more attention and more strengthening. But at least in South Africa, the SAJFP is fairly strong, not by any stretch of the imagination representing a majority of Jewish people, but strong as an organization. Alma, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, sure, no problem. First of all, I would like to thank all of the speakers. It was really great to hear your insights, and I really appreciate the efforts that you do. So my question is, do you think that Palestinians can do more to strengthen the sense of solidarity and unity movement that have been discussed today? Thank you.
Shall I pass that question on to Layth? Layth, do you want to make a note of the question, and we'll take a few comments and questions, and then pass it around to the speakers to respond to them. Nkamisile, you had two questions that you posted. Do you want to ask them directly?
Yes, thank you. First of all, the Abraham Accords, is this an embracing of Western culture and civilization? And two, India's strong relationship with Israel, what does it mean for BRICS? Thank you.
Thank you, Nkamisile. That BRICS question requires a South African to respond. So I'm going to pick out one of the South Africans that is here to respond to that. But speakers can make a note of both of those questions. Is there anyone else? Let me see who else has asked a question in the chat. Shafiq, do you want to ask your question? Shafiq, no? Okay, Shafiq's question was, do we really need to be united globally to confront the imperialists? as so many countries have been changed or won as a result of much less unified groups. So many people sell out but are not needed for change. So that's another question for our speakers. Are there any other questions, comments that comrades want to ask or make? Okay, if not, let me move back to the speakers to respond to those questions and make additional comments if they want to. Layth, shall we start with you again?
Oh yeah, happy to
from
start.
Palestine. Go for it.
Thank you, Naeem. Thank you for the questions, everyone. Some straightforward ones, some difficult ones. So I will start, I guess, with Elma's question. So I think this is probably, I'd love to hear, my comrades' thoughts on this more than I would like to hear my own, but I would just want to answer with a simple yes. I think there is a really important role that Palestinians can play, and I think that is that, just putting Palestine back into the framework of colonialism, imperialism globally. I think that's something that's really important. And I think we have a responsibility not to kind of exceptionalize the Palestinian struggle too much, because I think that there are so many important intersections of the oppression inflicted by Zionism as, the oppression inflicted by other oppressive movements around the world. So I think there's that really important kind of role to play in that discourse, and then based on that, build kind of real material bridges between Palestine and activists from around the world. I think that's something that we should take on. But I'd love to hear how we think you can do that and explore that further with people. And I'll maybe take the question about the Abraham Accords and the potential kind of what has driven that, and I think that what's driven that is very obviously capitalist interests more than anything else. I think that's something that is relatively obvious. It's when you look at a lot of Arab states, they're ruled by despots. They're not democratically run. When you look at, for example, the United Arab Emirates, what is the main driver? Why does the United Arab Emirates government do anything? It's to attract investment. That is the only thing that they ever care about. If they have an ailing economy, they'll make a deal with the devil in order to get more investment into their country. That's literally all they care about, is just constant kind of rolling in of cash and capital through their economy. And I think it's the same for others. It is sometimes kind of about slightly more maybe subtle forms of capitalism. For example, when we talk about surveillance, when, for example, thinking about with Morocco as an example, when we think about, sometimes it's just to kind of curry favor, just for kind of to be able to, for example, have better relations with other countries. So, for example, to please America or to please kind of other imperialist forces in our world. So I think that it's not really about embracing Western culture. I think it's more about embracing Western capital more than anything else. And I think that really kind of this also kind of speaks to the importance, I think, of unity, and this really links to the last question that I'm going to try to address, which is about being united globally to confront imperialists. And a lot of the Arab and Palestinian socialist thinkers were very clear about the links between these different struggles. And for example, George Habash, kind of one of the most important Palestinian leftist thinkers, was very clear that the struggle for a free Palestine runs through Arab capitals. And how that translated was looking at the oppression the lack of democracy, the subjugation of Arab populations by their leaders actually being antithetical, so like completely kind of opposed and standing in the way of freeing Palestine, because subduing people's hunger, thirst for their own freedom doesn't allow them to also fight for Palestinian freedom, and vice versa. So these struggles are all interconnected. All of these oppressive regimes rely on each other to prop each other up. And so when you see Israel teaming up with oppressive regimes, well, they are going to prop each other up. So when you have systems of oppression uniting, there's the only way to confront that is by being united as the people who want to overthrow these systems of oppression. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone needs to be part of the same movement, but we need to share ideas. We need to give each other strength and power when we can. So, for example, through economic relations. So, if anyone is able to support the industry or that is part of a resistance economy, for example, or if we're able to, for example, wrestle control over some of our services, and there are some really good examples, and I wish we had time to discuss them, some really kind of creative stuff happening, some really amazing work being done in Palestine to try to reclaim power. It'd be really good to share those experiences with people and learn from each other. So it doesn't necessarily just need to be the exact same movement, with a really hierarchical structure. No, it can be about learning. It can be about sharing resources. It can be about empowering each other and lifting each other up.
Thank you, Layth. Esther? Esther?
Okay, all right, thank you so much. I was struggling to unmute myself. It kept saying the host needs to unmute me. I hope it's fine if I speak without my camera on.
Sure.
Okay. I'd like to, I think, make a couple of comments with regards to the question as to what the Palestinian people can do to sort of support the movement and so forth. I think there is a lot that they could also do. I think particularly, for example, in countries where there are certain groups of people or certain sectors within the community or the country that are not really sensitized about what's going on and so forth. For a typical example is a couple of months back, sometime in April, we organized the Youth Engage with the Palestinian ambassador to Namibia when she was here in Windhoek. And so we gathered, a couple of youth leaders and student leaders from various campuses and so forth to just simply come and sit down with her and sort of hear her journey and her story and give us sort of some form of perspective and context of what's truly going on. And some of the feedback that we received back was that, oh, I didn't know about this, or, oh, okay, since now I know that this exists, how can I assist? How can we sort of bring more light to what's going on? And you had different people from different sectors. These ones are in media, these ones are more in student leadership. And people were willing to come forth and say, well, I'm willing to publish an article about what's happening and so forth. So I think how they could help is by telling their stories, and sort of whether it's by joining webinars or talks to sort of just sensitize people more about what's going on. I think that really helps, but also I think it will help so that the people on the continent are able to sort of see the challenges that what they're going through, that what we went through in terms of our history is quite similar to what apartheid Israel is currently doing to Palestine. I think when you look at the history of Namibia, what apartheid South Africa did is exactly what apartheid Israel is doing now. And a lot of people might not know that. So I'm not only speaking in the context of Namibia, but even in other countries. I think it will really help in sort of building the movement in of itself and sort of helping more people come and joining in the cause and really fighting for the freedom and independence of the people of Palestine. I think on the question that spoke about whether or not we truly need to sort of build like some global movement and so forth, I think the comments I'd like to make to that is, and again, I would use Namibia as a case study. Not even actually just Namibia, but most countries that were colonized. We see that the colonizers always did when the people within the country stood up to them and were united, which is why, for example, in Namibia, they implemented what we call the divide and rule strategy, where they tried to segregate and make sure that they spread you guys out so much so that you guys will have no platform and no opportunity to actually gather together. I mean, they would come up with various laws which would basically make it so difficult for gatherings of people, because they were afraid that if you guys were sort of gathered and unified, that what they were doing, the oppression that they were inflicting on the people and so forth, at the end of the day will be destroyed, because these people are basically, you are standing up and uniting. So I'm like, if so much power can be wielded, and we can see it when people within one country that are being oppressed, and how it can sort of lead to the freedom of others. Imagine, I think, when you build sort of a global movement, you know, where you now include even other people and you have the support and backing of other people, even though they might not directly be impacted with what you're going through at home. So I do really think, yes, a global movement is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Hassana, do you want to respond to any of the questions or make any additional comments? Hassana? I think Hassana did get disconnected for a couple of minutes and had to re-enter. Let me, while she's gathering herself, Suhayl?
I think quickly I'll just start off with a question on the Abraham Accords and why they have taken place, and if this is an embrace of Western culture by Arab states. I think in the quest of normalization, I think the Abraham Accords were just a mechanism to justify and further legitimize Israel's position within the world system. I mentioned the theory of the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery. So this is America's attempt of bringing in Israel into the core within the world system. So the mechanisms of the Abraham Accords are just an attempt to further, as Layth had mentioned, America's doing this and they've invited us, so let's do it so that we can have bilateral relations or multilateral relations. Because once you see the signatories of the Accords all have specific economic or trade interests with the US or particularly Israel. And I think it's visible now that even once the European Union started boycotting Russian gas, the first people they went to was the Israeli state, which in itself has less than 0.1% of national gas and what it can provide. So this is a ripple effect of the Abraham Accords. You know, within the world system, if America says you're bad, you're bad. If America says you're good, you're good. So it's just a mechanism to rather pacify and further absolve Israel from accountability. So it's not something that we should consider. It's not something we should uphold. It's something we should hold as a threat to the liberation of the Palestinian people. And as is, we should just further analyze and investigate why this agreements are being used as a mechanism. In essence, it is a mechanism of diplomatic warfare. And then quickly mentioning to the question of I think even on the question of BRICS, it's the same thing. Once any state, but I think someone from South Africa will pick that, any state as an ally to Israel has that power dynamic. You know, you will have an influencing capacity within the bloc, and it's the same thing that's happening within the African Union. Israel wants a stake, not just in resources, but the continued exploitation of the continent, certain voting repercussions, certain influencing capacity, and it's focused on lobbying within the African continent. And then just to mention on the question about Jewish solidarity, I think there's also been a lot of weaponization on who or what an anti-Semite is. because it focuses on, you can be an anti-Semite when you spew anti-Israeli vitriol, but once you spew anti-Palestinian vitriol, you're not labeled the same. So the continued weaponization of who an anti-Semite is really important, because anti-Semitism is being used to further criminalize dissent and support for the Palestinian people. So the pro-Palestinian movement is a very inclusive movement, and the only people I think I would say we need to understand and draw a line between the difference between who a Jew is and who a Zionist is. So the issue is not with the Jews. And we've seen a lot of organizations within the continent coming up together to fight the evangelical and Zionist movements in Kenya that are instilling Israeli propaganda, where we've seen church leaders coming out and saying they stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. We've seen Muslim leaders and different groupings. So it's a multifaceted fight which is inclusive of all religions, and it doesn't discriminate based on any religions, but based on ideology. And on the issue of imperialism, I will mention the backing. I think it's important to understand that there's power in numbers. So the more we can get, it's important, because you see what Israel is doing is targeting states to enhance its path to normalization and credibility within the world arena, the international international mechanisms, which is actively working. But imagine if all these countries and states came together to alienate Israel and actively institutionalize BDS mechanisms from a state level. Where would Israel be now? For Israel to be held accountable would be very easy, because they would have no allies within the international system. But you know, the basis of imperialism is not making friends. Imperialism is to assert and reach your goals and ensure that your state is protected, your borders are protected, and your lines of capitalism are protected and not rapid. So it's just a mechanism of world play. But I think even with a limited number of allies within the world spectre, it shouldn't be an issue. But just to mention that, you know, the Israeli issue is not a neutral issue. It's either you're pro-genocide or you are against genocide. Yeah, and I think as I finish now, I'll end with I think the Palestinian role in global solidarity is, at the very least, what should be happening is we're actively listening to you. So the more you speak, the more you give us information, we will take it. We don't want to speak over you. We want to speak with you and want to just raise what you're saying. We don't want to make up new stories. We want to actively advocate for what it is that you're standing for. So it's an issue of, once you speak, once you tell us, we're behind you and we're actively listening, we're actively feeling, and we're actively ensuring that the message you have is being spread across the world.
Thank you, Suhayl. Hassana, do you want to speak? Hassana, do you want to say anything? Where's Hassana? I think she might have disappeared again. Problem with the connection. Okay, let me then make a couple of points, and then I want to ask one more person to say a few things. One is on the issue of BRICS, Famisile. On the Palestinian question, BRICS is, as a whole, I would say, a huge disappointment, frankly. India is completely in bed with the Israeli state. India right now, I think, is the largest customer for Israeli weapons. Israel is I think, second largest supplier of weapons to India. India's policies in Kashmir, as well as internally against its own minorities, and particularly Muslims, has increasingly been mirroring what Israel does to Palestinians. And so India is certainly not a state that we can count on at the moment, and certainly not for the near future. neither Russia nor China is very pro-Palestinian in terms of their activities in multilateral fora or bilaterally with Israel. Brazil is kind of it depends on who is in government in Brazil. And so, you know, as a bloc, I don't believe that we can rely on BRICS to take a kind of pro-Palestinian position. Certainly the big players within BRICS, or the bigger players within BRICS are more pro-Israeli than they are pro-Palestinian. For China, it's really about their own economic interests rather than the interests of any decolonial struggle, etc. One other issue I want to mention, and I just want to mention it before I call on someone else to make a couple of comments, and that is that Esther raised the question of apartheid, and Esther being Namibian, not only knows very well what apartheid means, but also knows what apartheid means from the perspective of a colony of apartheid, being Namibian rather than South African. As you all know, in the past couple of years, there have been a number of studies that have been done by Palestinian NGOs, Israeli NGOs, and more recently, international NGOs, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, etc., on Israel's practices being apartheid in terms of particularly the Convention for the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. This all leads to the point of a campaign that is necessary at the United Nations in order to investigate at a governmental level or intergovernmental level to investigate Israel as an apartheid state, or Israel's practices as practices that constitute apartheid in terms of the convention. This campaign is, we believe, beginning, but I want to ask someone else to speak a little more on this apartheid issue for 2 minutes as well, and that is Saleh Hijazi. Saleh currently is based in Ramallah. Saleh was the Deputy Director of Amnesty International Palestine and a main author of the Amnesty International report on Israel's policies being apartheid. Very importantly for us now, and we want to use this opportunity to welcome Saleh to Africa. Saleh has been appointed the African coordinator, the coordinator for Africa for the BDS National Committee. And he is going to be relocating out of Ramallah into the continent so that we can use and abuse him more than we have been already. But Saleh, apart from that introduction to us welcoming you as an honorary African, can you speak for 2 minutes on the apartheid issue and the campaign or impending campaign to investigate Israel's apartheid at the United Nations? For some reason, we can't hear you, Saleh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can. Go for it.
Yes, now we can. All right. I was just expressing my thanks and gratitude to you, Naeem, to the panelists, and to the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network. This is a brilliant, amazing event, and thanks for the warm welcome, particularly that last bit you said about being an honorary African. A great. I don't think I've earned it yet, but hopefully I will be able to do that soon from the continent. So as Naeem was saying, I come to the BDS after having worked at Amnesty International, producing the report that basically documents and concludes that Israel is perpetrating the crime against humanity of apartheid against the Palestinian people across their fragments in what is now Israel, 1948, in the occupied territories of 67, but also including the Palestinian refugees, particularly by denying them the right to return. Now, as in the situation in apartheid in South Africa or in Southern Africa more generally, the UN did play, and UN mechanisms and institutions did play an important role. Despite, and I have to say this, that these international organizations are part of the international order and that facilitated, maintained, and allowed colonialism to go with impunity. Yet there are parts of that system which we should use tactically and strategically, including some of the mechanisms within the UN. The International Criminal Court is one of them, but also another one is the UN General Assembly. And this is where usually, historically, we've got massive support for Palestine, particularly because the majority of the General Assembly is composed of Global South countries that vote for issues that are intersectional, issues that are shared, where there is collective concern and collective struggle. I mean, the situation has changed, but one of these mechanisms was the Special Committee Against Apartheid, which was established in 1962, actually before the Convention on the Suppression and Elimination of the Crime of Apartheid in 1973. So the BDS, which I'm now part of, along with its partners around the world, are calling on the UN to investigate apartheid. And this is particularly calling on the UN General Assembly to establish or reconstitute, reinstitute, revive, because it has never been really kind of eliminated or struck out, the Special Committee Against Apartheid, to look into the situation in Palestine and against Palestinians, but also wherever apartheid may be taking place around the world. So please, and we could absolutely share the information through the Palestine Solidarity, Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network. Please follow the BDS channels on this campaign. The hashtag is #UN Investigate Apartheid. You can also follow that, and we'll be putting on the pressure on countries around the world to support a resolution that we know South Africa is leading on, to condemn Israel's apartheid Palestinians and re-establish the committee so that it investigates Israel's apartheid and also prevents apartheid from happening elsewhere. Would be great to hear the reaction from the panelists on this. I'm not sure about the time, but that would be great. Thanks very much, Naeem and all.
Thank you, Saleh. No, Saleh, the honorary title stands partly because you're Palestinian and all Palestinians are honorary Africans, and partly because you're thinking of relocating, or you're about to relocate. Once you become resident here, then we'll drop the honorary, and you'll just be an African. Thanks for that, Saleh. I think that right now this is probably one of the most important campaigns at a global level, certainly at an intergovernmental level, in terms of supporting the Palestinian struggle. If we can get this moved along at the United Nations General Assembly, to firstly begin investigating Israel's actions and to see whether they are whether they constitute apartheid, as the various NGOs have said that they do, or perhaps I should say, for the UN General Assembly to confirm that the reports of the various NGOs are correct in terms of the labeling of Israel's acts as apartheid. That's the first thing. And then secondly, to continue the process to reactivate the Special Committee Against Apartheid, so that we have a structure accountable to the United Nations General Assembly that would continue an investigation of apartheid, of course, not just in the case of Israel more broadly, but particularly and for now in the case of Israel. So I think that this is an important campaign at an intergovernmental level, but that also means that as civil society, we have an important role to play in pushing our governments to do this. We know that the role played by the Organization of African Unity in terms of South African apartheid and Namibian and apartheid in Namibia was a crucial role on the continent as well as within the United Nations structures to take that forward, to ensure that the special committee was set up, to ensure that support was given to the anti-apartheid struggle, etc. And that in the current context will not happen unless there is very strong push from civil society, and particularly in this case from African civil society. So we certainly have our work cut out for us. On that note, I'm going to move to an end. It's 6 minutes after 8. So thank you firstly to the PAPSN Youth Task Team for putting this webinar together, a very important webinar, I believe, with a very important topic. So the whole Youth Task Team for organizing this, and for the speakers, Layth Hanbali, Ester Shitana, Hassana, Adongo, Ibrahim, Suhayl Omar, as well as Saleh and Sion, who came in impromptu. And also, she didn't speak, but again, to express our that our thoughts are with her and her family. Samar Lili, who was supposed to have spoken, but wasn't able to make it because her father is in hospital. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to everyone who's joined and has been part of this. As I said earlier on, if you want to be in contact with PAPSN and to be involved in our various activities, then please contact PAPSN either through our Twitter account or Facebook, or email info@papsn.net. You can check it on our website as well. We would very much like people across the continent to be involved in the various campaigns of the network, campaigns that I spoke about earlier on and that our speakers spoke about as well. And we hope that this will now be the first of many webinars that will be held, and also in-person events that will be held. We look forward to the other PAPSN task teams, the Christian Solidarity task team, the militarization task team, the lobbying task team, etc., to also pull together their own events in the near future. Thank you all very much for your participation. Thank you, speakers. Goodbye. Amandla.